Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures, Daily Dose of Nature. I'm your host, Sunny Vanderstar. Today's topic is where to see tundra wildflowers with Nat Hab, and it will be presented by our fabulous Nat Hab Expedition Leader, Eleanor Edye. Eleanor, thanks for being here today. We always love your presentations. So let's go ahead and dive in and see all the beauty.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Sunny, and thanks everybody who's here today. Today we're going to be talking about flowers of the Arctic tundra, and I chose this particular image as my cover slide because I just love it so much. And we're going to get into a lot of the things that we're seeing in this image. So, as Sunny said, my name is Eleanor Edye. I'm one of the expedition leaders here with Natural Habitat Adventures. I am based out of Canada, and I have personally a lot of experience working with flowers in the Arctic and other plants as well. I am going to be one of our ELs on our summer Churchill trip. So those who may be going up to the Arctic this summer may get a chance to see me and talk about some flowers in person. So hopefully you're here because you want to learn more about Arctic plants. This may be because you are going on a trip this year and you want to be better able to appreciate the carpets of flowers that you see or that you're walking on, or it may just be that you are interested and want to know more. In any case, what I'm going to be focusing on today is talking about the adaptations that plants have to cold Arctic environments. And I'm going to be looking at examples of these adaptations to common plants that you can find on Nat Hab's Arctic trips that run in the summer. So we're going to focus, like I said, on those common species, but wherever I can, I've threw in some pictures of some more uncommon or locally common ones, just because I like to look at more plants and talk about more plants. The one that I've got up here on the slide here is the northern lady's slipper. This is a species of plant native to North America, specifically northern North America and cold, harsh environments. It's widespread in Canada as well as in some of the Rocky Mountains, going into as far south as Montana. It's beautiful, and it is one of the largest of the northern orchids. There are a number of orchid species that can be found in those treeless expanses of the Arctic, but many of them are very small. Okay, let's move on and talk about where we're talking about today. Because I've called my talk, Arctic wildflowers and where you can see them with Nat Hab. But there are, in fact, many definitions of what the Arctic is and how you define it, and whether or not we can say, oh, yes, I have been to the Arctic. It really depends on who you're talking to and what you're talking about. This map here, every line on this map, every colored line, represents somebody's idea of the Arctic. The bolder lines are some definitions set out by humans for human needs. Because often when we talk about the Arctic, when it comes to what humans need, we're looking at things like difficulty to access healthcare, difficulty to maintain infrastructure in cold environments. We may be looking at difficulties of shipping items to these areas because they are very remote, isolated communities. And so both the red line and the very dark green line represent some human ideas of what the Arctic is. But for things like plants and animals, whether or not you have a hard time, buying sour cream on a Sunday at 6 o'clock, doesn't really apply to those organisms, right? They have other ideas in mind as to what may control their definition of what the Arctic is. So some of those definitions, one of them is the Arctic Circle, the location of the line that runs along 66 degrees of northern latitude. And if you look at the center of this map, the dot there is the geographic North Pole, and the very precise small black line circle is our Arctic Circle. This is one definition of the Arctic. It's very far north. Not many people and not many animals and plants are found here. It does apply to some definitions of the Arctic, because beyond this point, you're always going to have at least one day every year where the sun doesn't rise, and at least one day every year where the sun is up for 24 hours. So this definitely impacts plants and animals in the area, but it's not our most important contributor of where we find Arctic plants. If you look at some of the narrower lines, for example, the narrow red line, the narrow blue line, and there's also a narrow green line. These represent some other areas that are much more important to where we find those Arctic plants. So these guys here, these lines that we're talking about, are other things that affect the way plants interact with the environment. One of those is the location of what we call continuous permafrost. So this is an area beyond which the ground is always frozen throughout the year. There will be, in most areas, some layer that thaws in the summer, but underneath that layer that's thawed, if you dig down a little bit, you're going to come to permanently frozen ground. So that's our layer of continuous permafrost, and as you can imagine, that has a lot of impact on how deep a plant can send its roots. It also has a lot of impact on how warm the soils get, and therefore how many nutrients will be available to those plants. And if you look at that line, so that line is the red thin line throughout that map, it matches up pretty closely with some other lines on there as well. And that being the line where we don't see trees beyond anymore. Trees don't like to have shallow soils that are really cold. So beyond that area with continuous permafrost, we tend not to see trees. And we get into our areas that have really where we would call it more of a tundra. So when we're talking about our Nat Hab trips, I'm going to pop up some stars on our map here, and you can see where they are in relation to these definitions of the Arctic. This first star that came up on our map is the location of Churchill, Manitoba in Canada, and this is where we run our summer beluga trips as well as our fall polar bear trips and our winter Northern Lights trips. But we do have other trips that are in the Arctic as well. This next star here represents the location roughly of our Greenland trip, and you can see that not only is it close to the Arctic Circle, so you're getting a lot of daylight in the summer, it's well within pretty well everybody's definitions of what the Arctic is. And then Iceland is the next star that comes up, because of course we have Iceland trips that run, and our Greenland trips start off in Iceland, so you can get there. So you experience both those places. We also have a trip that runs in northern Norway that visits Svalbard. So these last two stars represent northern Norway and into Svalbard. And of all of these locations, we're going to see slightly different plants because we're in different environments, and they're all a little bit differently placed around where they are on that tree line. Churchill is in a very transitional area, so you're still able to find areas with trees and areas then without trees. Greenland and Iceland are well known for not having trees, so it's going to be full Arctic vegetation there. Northern Norway is treed, so it's not beyond the tree line, but it has a lot of cold and other Arctic adapted species, and Svalbard is well beyond that tree line, and you're going to see exclusively Arctic plants in that area. This next picture coming up here is just giving us an idea of what we're talking about here, getting into the tundra. So you can see here a transition from a treed area in the lower part of this image to a treeless area in the upper part of this image. And when we talk about these treeless areas, one of the words that we use for them is tundra. The tundra comes from the Finnish word tunturi. As I've been told, I don't speak Finnish myself, meaning treeless plain. So it's very wide open areas. They may be hilly or rocky, but overall we're talking about, they feel very open because you can see very far across to the horizon. And they are the coldest of all biomes on the planet Earth. Now, when we draw that tree line on a map, we draw it as a single line because that's all we can do. But where that zone is from where trees exist and then trees don't exist isn't really a hard line. It's what we call an ecotone, meaning a transitional area. You're going to go through areas where trees are thicker and then they become more sparse. Then trees start to get really scraggly and disfigured. Then you get to the point where you might have the species, like you might have a pine or a spruce, but it's not able to grow upright. and then you get to the area where there are no trees whatsoever. And in this transitional area, like we have around the Churchill region, trees can look quite odd. So this is a really typical tree of what we might see in that tree line ecotone. It's been heavily impacted by some of the abiotic, meaning physical characteristics of the area, like a strong wind, blowing ice, cold air, cold soil, lack of water, short growing season. And like I said, as those conditions become more extreme, a species like this is white spruce, will not be able to grow upright anymore. While this one is heavily impacted by those factors, it's still, we can recognize it as something that is a tree. We call them sometimes flag trees or one-sided trees. And just to give you kind of a simplified form, a diagrammatic view of what this can look like, again, at the bottom, we're going from that tree line area where we have continuous forest through to that broken forest area where we have what are called tree islands, where trees do exist as trees, but they're in little pockets. Then we go further again, we get scattered individuals, and then we get to the area where we call it the tree species line, where that species of tree, whatever it might be in that area, can simply not exist because the conditions are too harsh. So as we talk about these various areas and the species that we're discussing, I'm mostly going to be talking about species from either within that transitional area or beyond the transition into the tundra itself. Because all of these areas have some things in common. Quick aside here, which plant are you looking at here? Why, this is the Greenland primrose. It's a beautiful small plant. It's found throughout northern Canada as well as into Greenland, throughout Asia as well, the Russian Far East. So it's a circumboreal plant, meaning it exists all around the top of the northern hemisphere. And it's actually named after a fjord in western Greenland, which is where it was first described. Now, this particular plant, like a lot of our tundra plants that we're going to talk about, is very, very small. This entire plant is maybe 2 to 3 inches tall. Very common in the Arctic for reasons that we'll talk about, because they do face so very many challenges. One of those, as you can imagine, is just cold temperatures. The Arctic, while it is getting warmer as we see climate change happening, it is still colder than everywhere else in the world. So these plants are dealing with cold temperatures at all times of year. But they're also dealing with extreme temperature fluctuations. In Churchill, for example, a plant may need to deal with a midsummer day where temperatures may be as high as 70 or even 80 degrees Fahrenheit, and then dipping down to freezing temperatures throughout the evening. So these plants are going to have their growing season interrupted by frost days. It's not like your tomatoes that we put out and we leave out for 120 days and they expect, in fact, those tomatoes demand 120 days of frost-free weather. These plants have to be able to cope with frost even when they're in their active growing phase. They're also dealing with a short growing season. So days that we have temperatures above the freezing mark are very short. Depending where you are in the world, where you are in the Arctic rather, this may be as short as 40 to 50 days or as long as around the 80-day mark. But either way, it's significantly shorter than what we might experience in the more southern latitudes. They're dealing with strong winds. And in fact, you'll see as we talk about these adaptations that strong winds are a tremendous factor that these plants have to guard against. It's one of the defining characters really of living and spending time in the Arctic is you spend a lot of time in the wind. Remember how we said there were no trees? As that wind blows, on days when it blows, there's basically nothing to block the wind for you or for these plants either. So they have to come up with ways to live with that stress. They are also living with possibly very low levels of moisture. And this may be the case even for a species like our Greenland primrose here, that I can tell you just looking at this picture, is living in a fairly wet, mushy environment because it's surrounded by other species that like wet, mushy, boggy conditions. However, it's likely going to be trying to grow while the water is still frozen inside the soil. So when the soil is frozen, when it's below that freezing point, that water is not available to the plants. So they have very, very long times of the year when the sun might be shining, the wind might be blowing. They have a lot of demands on water in their system, but they don't have any accessible water to them because it's still frozen within the soil. And all of these plants are also going to be dealing with poor soils, meaning that they have very low levels of available nutrients. Not a lot of things like potassium and nitrogen for these plants to pick up and turn into growing tissue. So lots of things that are providing stresses to these plants. So I've picked a number of species that are found in pretty well all of these areas that Nat Hab visits, so you can maybe keep your eyes open for them if you're traveling to one of these places this year, or at least have more to know and to think about as we look at these species. Because they all have to be both physically adapted to these physical factors like wind and cold, rocky soils, but they also have to have those physiological adaptations that allow them to not die, even though they just froze in July when they were trying to grow, for example. So they've lots of things going on. So let's talk about adaptations to these extreme conditions by looking at one of our common Arctic plants. This plant is called purple saxifrage, sometimes called purple mountain saxifrage, depending where you are. Like a lot of plants adapted for the Arctic, this is one that you can find in alpine areas as well. So that's why it gets its alternate name of purple mountain saxifrage. Now, this is a lovely picture. You can see the beautiful flowers on this plant. You might think, oh, this is gorgeous. I want to see it. Surely it's going to jump out at me on the tundra, but I'm here to tell you that it's probably not going to, because often it looks more like this kind of slightly sad looking plant that we can see in this image here. So the scientific name of this particular plant is saxifraga, which is where we get our saxifrage from, and oppositifolia, meaning it has opposite leaves. The leaves come out of the stem on opposite sides from each other. And you can actually see some of the four-ranked leaves on this particular picture. Now, I love this photo. This is a photo I took myself in Churchill when I was trying to look at birds, and I realized I was almost stepping on this plant, and I got distracted by the plants instead of looking for birds, but that's okay. So these plants are very early season flowering plants. They usually come out as soon as the snow melts, and I'll talk about that in a second. But they are also very, very slow growing. So these plants will grow maybe 2 leaves in a year. So that doesn't sound very impressive, and in many ways it's not, but they are slow growing and they are long lived. So this particular plant is likely at least 20 years old, if not longer. And you might say, okay, I'm sorry, I forgot to put something for scale in this image, but look around the plant and you can make out the individual sand grains. So this is a very, very tiny plant indeed when you have that sense of scale in there, that you can pick out the sand grains just as well as you can pick out the leaves here. In fact, if you were looking at it not in flower, you'd probably think it was a moss. So it's something that small. This plant is giving us an idea of a common theme that we're going to run into with our Arctic plants. They are tiny, tiny, tiny things. And their flowers are often bigger than you'd expect for the size of the plant, because they still have to attract pollinators. But the plants themselves are very small, and many of the flowers are small as well, and they're also very low down. So tundra plants are best appreciated from a low position yourself, perhaps on your hands and knees, and sometimes it's even fun to bring out a magnifying glass or a hand lens or something like that to really get a sense of the beauty of these plants when you're in person. Now, like I said, this is purple saxifrage. Saxifrage means rock breaker. There's a lot of thoughts as to why it might be called that. But saxifrage as a whole, there's around 440 species, and many of them are found throughout the Arctic. Now, you'll note that this plant, I said it was at least 20 years old, but you can see also it's on very, very poor soil. Like you can imagine the wind blowing the sand around. that this might be a very difficult substrate for this plant to attach to. Very few binding agents like pieces of organic matter and a nice loam to hold things in place. This is soil that churns over and blows around very often. And as the water in the soil or in the sand freezes, it also pushes sand out of the way, creating frost boils. So think about how a plant is able to live there for multiple decades and how similar species might live here. They're going to form a really deep root system, specifically a kind of taproot. So this is actually a different species, and it's certainly not that exact plant. I would never dig up a plant just to show you this, but I love having an image here to show you. And it gives you an idea what the underground portion of this plant may look like. So there's actually a lot of dead material below that top layer of living tissue that you may not be seeing. It may in fact be covered in sand by this point, as well as that very, very deep, strong root that's anchoring it in place. Now, we would call this generally a type of cushion plants, meaning that it forms a little cushiony hummock on a small, whether it's a gravel or sandy ridge like this. A lot of our Arctic species do form cushions like this, especially on soils that are very poor and prone to wind blow and frost boiling. So this particular species has been around at least since the last ice age, and it is the northernmost wildflower on Earth, as it's found on the northernmost piece of land on Earth, which is Kafflekubben Island, which is on the northern tip of Greenland. So it is so well adapted for surviving extremely cold temperatures, as well as areas that lack sunlight, lack water, lack growing seasons. Even when they have a period of time as short as 20 or 30 days where they're able to grow and set leaves and produce flowers, they are still able to survive in these regions. And they do this in a number of ways. So I said before, you're probably not going to see flowers on this plant if you're traveling to an Arctic time in the summer, because these things flower soon as the snow is gone. In fact, they're often flowering before the snow is gone. As that layer of snow melts in the springtime, it's melting during the day when temperatures are about freezing, and then it usually refreezes at night into ice particles before continuing to melt again the next day. Now, ice is really good at transmission of light. So good that these plants are actually able to start their physiological processes by collecting sunlight while there's still ice on top of them, and they will be starting up photosynthesis. So they'll be starting to make their own energy, and they will be producing and opening up their flowers even while they are still covered in ice. How crazy is that? And they're also creating little warm pockets so that pollinator species that may be small insects living within that cushion are able to be active as well, even though it's below freezing outside that little area. So for example, one study testing clumps of these plants in northern Greenland recorded a temperature inside a clump of 38 degrees Fahrenheit, so around 4 degrees Celsius, whereas the outside air temperature was only 10 degrees Fahrenheit or minus 12 Celsius. They're really little greenhouses, and they're using the ice as the greenhouse to create their little pocket of warmth. It's really just an amazing species, and always really exciting to see as the first wildflower of the season. Now, they're not the only saxifrage by far that are in the Arctic, depending where you are. You may see other saxifrages that flower later in the season. This is an example here of one called three-toothed saxifrage. It is also a cushion species. Look at what it's growing in. This particular one's growing in a pile of gravel. So you can bet if I were to dig this up, you'd see that same system with a great big taproot on it, holding it and anchored in place. And they are able to grow in sand, in gravel, right in the cracks of rocks. They're very much not picky about the quality of the substrate that they throw their seeds into. So these guys flower a little bit later in the summer, but they produce beautiful flowers as well. Take a look at that. Very, very small flowers. Again, you're going to be on your hands and knees to see these, but isn't that just a stunning flower? I mean, if that were the size of a, If that were maybe a few inches across, you'd see it being used in flower arrangements all around the world because it's so gorgeous. But alas, it's probably about the size of a dime or so. Here's another saxifrage coming up. This is tufted saxifrage. And this particular one, unlike the three-toothed saxifrage that I showed before, that's a North American species. This one here is a Eurasian species growing in the north of areas like Norway and Scotland and into Svalbard. So you can see a lot of similarities here. You're probably starting to get your eyes on for what saxifrages look like. They've always got those 5 petals. They're cushion plants, so they grow quite low to the ground, and they like those rocky soils. Here's another one coming up. This is mossy saxifrage. I guess if you squint, it kind of looks like a moss. And this is another Eurasian species native to northwestern Europe, including Iceland, the Faroe Islands, Norway, and areas of Northern Ireland as well. It's also been introduced to areas as a garden species. If you have like a sandy or rocky garden, people like to grow saxifrages in there as well. And you can see again, you've got that cushion plant structure, you've got those the 5-petaled flowers. So you can probably now, even if you hadn't thought about saxifrages ever before, you probably could pick out a saxifrage in the Arctic now, if you had to. Now let's move on to another species that ties with our purple saxifrage for some of the northernmost ground cover in the Arctic, because we're going to talk about Arctic avens, which is, look at this, it's absolutely covering the ground here. And if you're not impressed, that's okay. It's not a very impressive photo, except when you start to think about how harsh this environment is here. So this is an area, you can see little pockets of trees. We're right at the edge of the tree line. In fact, Hudson Bay is just in the background, so a great big pool of cold water producing lots of ice. The distance to permafrost in this area is not very far at all, so it's just a very thin layer of very sandy and rocky soil to grow in. And a lot of the ground cover here is this next species, which is called Arctic avens. So from far away, you can think that it almost looks like a turf cover or like grass. But when you get closer up, and if you see it during the flowering season, it looks like this. So it has a white flower with a yellow center. You might think it looks kind of daisy-like. And the base of the plant, what looks to us like grass, are actually the standing green leaves of that plant, which are very mat forming. So they grow in a big trailing mat across the tundra. It covers an awful lot of ground in this area, and it is by far and away the dominant ground cover species in the high Arctic, as well as in very, very poor soil areas in some of the lower Arctic regions too. It's such an absolute species of the tundra that fossils of this plant have been used to study episodes of climate change and shift in Arctic vegetations, and we have a whole period of time named after this plant when it was the dominant plant in more southerly areas in a colder time. So what's going on with this plant? Well, lots of things. So let's talk about what this plant is showing us. And it has a lot of things in common with our purple saxifrage. Some of the things I haven't even mentioned yet. One of the things it has in common is that it has green leaves that are retained on the plant until they stop being useful. So this plant has to go to a lot of work to produce a leaf. And so if that leaf is still good at the end of the year, it's going to hold on to that leaf and actually keep it green throughout the winter, so it's ready to start photosynthesis as soon as summer starts, or really as soon as spring starts. The age of those leaves might be 2, 3, 4 years before they degrade so much they're no longer useful. And then that plant is going to go through a process called senescence for that leaf. The same thing that you see on leaves in deciduous trees in the northern hemisphere, right? It pulls out the nutrients, it gets dry and crunchy, and then it falls off. Except in this plant, it doesn't fall off. The nutrients get pulled out, it gets dry and crunchy, and then it stays attached to the plant. So you can see some of the dead material here within the live plant species. And this is a really common feature of tundra plants. And you may have noticed it with especially our purple saxifrage photo that we saw too. Even when their dead leaves are dead, they're not done their job yet. And their job when they are dead is actually to be a windbreak for those live leaves. So we may think of dead leaves as not being a significant windbreak, but I assure you, if you're a leaf that's only about 1/2 inch long, living in these extremely harsh environments that slowing down the wind, even just a little bit, makes a really, really big difference, especially in the winter. Now, if you haven't been up to the Arctic in the winter, you may be picturing a lot of snow because we think about northern areas having snow. But in fact, most of the Arctic is quite dry and there's not a lot of snow cover on the ground. What there is gets picked up by the wind, blown around until it's in these very tiny ice particles, and then it just hits any plants or anything else that's in its way. So any part of the plant that's standing in the way of that cold, icy winter wind absolutely gets blasted to almost nothing and will inevitably die. So this standing dead material is a really common feature of our tundra plants to help slow down that wind. And we see it especially in areas that are really exposed of these plants that are living in those very, very high Arctic areas or very, very poor areas there. Now, another thing that these plants do is have what's called heliotropism. So heliotropy is when a plant, some part of a plant, tracks the sun. So these guys are little sunflowers, but unlike the sunflowers that you might have in your gardens at home that are actually trying to keep their faces out of the sun because they get too hot, these little guys want the heat. So they are turning their flowers throughout the day to use as like little solar radiation collection dishes, warming up the pieces of the flower itself. And studies have shown us that the flowers that are, if you experimentally remove the ability of these plants to move, and then you have another population that you let them move, they are faster to set fruit. They are faster to produce their flower. Everything happens faster when they're able to collect more energy from the sun. And this can be advantageous if you're a little insect in the area as well. So you can see that this particular image has a little ant crawling into it. This would be one of the pollinator species of this plant. And it's not just coming in for nectar, it's also coming in to warm up. So between those giant giant, it's about the size of a quarter, okay? Giant flowers, you can see them from ages. You can stand up and see these flowers, they're that big. Between that and the fact that they follow the sun, these little guys are never wanting for pollinators. So they do a very good job of producing seed, and they actually use the wind to disperse their seeds. So this is what the fruit of that species looks like. After it sets, the flower is pollinated, it's going to set that fruit, and it's actually going to extend the flower stalk up to better catch the wind. And once that flower stalk is up high enough and it's got its seeds ready to go, it's going to be released into the wind. And these seeds can actually be carried in the wind quite a distance as they go. And you get some very beautiful landscapes, especially this would be, I think, it was around mid-July or so that everything had finished setting fruit, possibly late July. And you get these beautiful fields covered in this wispy substance with everything just blowing in the wind. Okay, yes, I know. So you can see those flower stalks elevate there. They actually also help to slow down the wind. They're only going up during the summer and releasing those seeds, and then they will also senesce, so all of the nutrients will be pulled back down into the plant, and those flower stalks remain up through the winter to also help slow down any wind around the plant. And those flower stalks usually, by the end of the winter, they're completely gone and blasted off. The wind's just taken them, but they've done their job at that point and helped protect the plant overall. So here's another common plant of all these areas. This is the Lapland rosebay, sometimes called an Arctic rhododendron or Lapland rhododendron. It is actually a rhododendron species. You can, if you have rhododendrons in your garden, you can see that it looks the same, right? The flowers are pretty well the exact same, except again, we're talking maybe the size of a dime or maybe a nickel here. And we find it in the subarctic and Arctic regions of North America, Europe, and Asia, as well as at altitude. Now, this one is more of a subarctic plant, so you may not find it in the very, very harsh regions, being that this is actually a very low-growing shrub. It's not a cushion-forming species. It grows a little bit higher. And for that to happen, it has to be able to grow in a more sheltered area, because just like with our other species, if it grew in a windy area in the winter, all of that tissue, all of those leaves and stems would just get stripped off by the wind. So this is what it looks like. Like I said, it's a little shrub. The whole thing is maybe, I don't know, let me think in inches here, between 4 and 8 inches high for a big one. So like I said, it needs a little more shelter. It doesn't live on the extreme edge of the tundra, but it does show us adaptations for living in the Arctic and in some of those consistently harsh environments. It also does have evergreen leaves. So it has to have enough snow in an area that it's covering up the leaves so they don't get hurt by that Arctic wind in the winter. So it tends to be found in areas, for example, around other shrubs, around pockets of trees, behind boulders, areas where the wind has slowed down enough that it's not going to be hurting these leaves. Because they stay green through the winter though, just like an evergreen tree, they are ready to start photosynthesis first thing in the spring as soon as they are exposed to the light. Their leaves are very, very thick and waxy to help reduce water loss. Again, even though the species might be growing in a very boggy area, it still has to contend with the fact that there's never enough water for it. It always has to fight against the loss of water. So very thick, waxy leaves like you might find in a more desert adapted plant, for example. Another thing it does, which is similar to a lot of other Arctic plants, is it actually makes its flowers for next year, this year. So you can see in this image that we have flowers on our rhododendron or our Lapland rosebank. And then if you look at part of the, like where the green whorls of not petals, of leaves are, you can see in the middle of those leaves, there are buds. And those buds are actually going to be next year's flowers. So they are made well in advance using this year's extra energy so that they are ready to go early in the summer and have time to set their seed and develop that fruit before winter comes again. So they always have to be, I guess, thinking ahead and thinking about the next harsh summer to come. So these persistent leaves like this, the thick leaves to keep water in, are shared with a lot of other Arctic species, including this other one coming up, which is another really common one that we're going to find in all of the areas that Nat Hab is running our summer trips here. This is a species called the net-veined willow. And if you have, weeping willows or other beautiful willows in your yard, you might think, what? This doesn't look like any kind of willow I know. But it is. It's a salix species, just like every other willow out there. And that orange structure in the middle there is just the end of a pen that I threw down for this image. So this one here, you can see the size of the leaves. You can see that the stem is actually trailing along the ground. So instead of this tree growing up, it's a trailing species of tree. And we can get pedantic and say, well, is it a tree if it can never grow up? We'll leave that to the philosophers, but it is a willow species that because of the harsh environments is forced to grow laterally instead of upwards. So it's also, like I said, found in all these areas. It's showing us a lot of these adaptations again. So like those big, thick, waxy leaves to help control water loss. You might see in this image that there's some, I guess you might call them pussy willows or the flowering structures of the species, and they're actually very woolly. And the leaves themselves, if you looked at them with a microscope, you would see hairs on the leaves as well. And a lot of the time we see hairs on leaves or on flowers or on other parts of the plants in the Arctic. And this is yet another adaptation to slow down water loss by slowing down the wind. One of the ways plants lose water as the wind blows over them is that it's always removing the slightly more humid air around the plant and forcing the plant to suck up more water to replace that humidity. So on a windy day, if you have fine little hairs on you, you are going to lose less water than you would if you did not have those hairs. So we do see a lot of our Arctic species having those fine hairs on the Arctic on those plants. Now, this is another plant that has hairs, but this one has hairs for different reasons. And it has hairs to deal with another one of the challenges that a lot of Arctic plants face. And this is a lack of available nutrients. Specifically for this one, a lack of available nitrogen. Now, if your tomatoes are looking kind of pale and sickly and you need to add nitrogen or iron to them, you just go out to the hardware store and buy a bag of fertilizer. Arctic plants aren't able to do this. So they have a number of different ways, depending on the species, that they might seek out new nutrients. And this is an example of a carnivorous plant that is quite common at the tree line and in the lower Arctic. This is called common butterwort. And when you look at the leaves there, you can see little dots on them. Those are sticky, resinous, mucilaginous hairs that grow on the leaves to trap insects that come down. And once those insects are trapped, the leaves secrete a digestive enzyme, so they're able to digest those insects and then absorb the nutrients right into the leaf itself, so it can go on to make more healthier leaves. Pretty harsh world if you're if you're living in the Arctic and looking for more nutrients like this. These insects are usually attracted to the plant because that sticky substance looks like water or nectar, which is often attractive to insects as they're looking for a water source or as a source to lay eggs, for example. And this is what, on the left-hand side there, you can see that this is what their flower looks like. And they hold their flower well away from their leaves, so they're not competing with the leaves want insects to eat and the flower wants insects to pollinate. They've got to keep it separate so they don't confuse and eat their pollinator species. Now, this particular one, this is the common butterwort. It's found in northern North America, but there are species of butterworts that are found in northern Eurasia as well. This is another species. It's called the alpine butterwort, but it's also found at higher latitudes throughout Eurasia. You can see that this one, the leaves look pretty well the exact same, perhaps a little bit longer. The flower looks very, very similar, just a different color. So it's doing the exact same thing. It's just a different species in the same type of harsh environment. So nutrients really are incredibly limiting for Arctic plants. And in areas that have been naturally fertilized, we see them just going gangbusters. So this particular image here is an image of a fox den. So within, like underground in this area, we have foxes that are birthing and raising kits, and they're bringing food back to their den, and they're peeing and pooping and dragging out animal remains and bones in the area. So it's really a very natural yet artificial fertilization of this area. And fox dens are almost always really easy to jump out and find on the landscape because they are so much more lush than anywhere else that you're going to see on the tundra. So just seeing what happens when you add nutrients, nothing else has changed for these plants, but they are able to grow in a much more robust, much faster, much higher, much greener way when you add fertilizer to them. So it really is a limiting factor for a lot of those plants. Now, coming here to one of the last species here we're going to talk about, and this is many people's one of their favorites, and I would certainly include it as one of my favorites as well. This is the fireweed plants. And fireweed is actually quite widespread. It's not only found in the Arctic, it's found through the boreal, and it's found in some other areas as well. It's known really commonly as a roadside weed. It's a pioneer species, meaning that it's one of the earliest to move into disturbed areas where it colonizes quickly and it can take over and make these giant swaths of fireweed, and which is why we often see it in burned areas, why it's the name fireweed, and why we often see it on the roadsides, because those are often disturbed areas, especially right after a road's gone in. Now, they are kind of one of the, like I said, colonizer species, so they do persist for long times. They are perennial plants, but eventually they are often outcompeted by other things like willows or other shrubs. There are also other common names for this. You might know it as rosebay or willow herb or balmweed. It's found in so many different areas, and it is one of the plants that we look for on the tundra, especially towards the end of the summer. So how is it adapted? You can see it's not small, it's not cushiony, it's not, right, it doesn't have big, thick, waxy leaves. What it does do is produce a tremendous number of seeds. So it's more taking advantage of potential openings on the ground and making a ton of seeds rather than investing in a single individual that may be able to survive a long time. So For a plant in good shape with lots of pollinators, a single plant of fireweed may produce as many as 80,000 seeds. So they are playing the numbers game. They are getting their seeds out there and they're hoping for the best. So this is why we're seeing them through the Arctic, but also in other areas too, where just having a huge number of seeds ready to go when a frost boil happens or when somebody brings a road through or when a fire happens, that's their strategy for dealing in these areas. Now they are beautiful, beautiful plants, and because they're one of the later ones to come out in the summer, they often form a carpet of purple across the tundra in areas that are dominated by fireweed. And if you're lucky enough to have friends who make jam, you may also have people out there picking flowers to make jam and jelly with. Now, this isn't the only fireweed that we find in the Arctic. This is a fairly tall one. It can grow up to about 3 to 4 feet tall. Sometimes it's shorter, but there is also another species called dwarf fireweed that is a little bit better at growing in more Arctic and more northerly conditions. It still is a weedy species, so it's still playing that numbers game and pumping out lots of seeds. It's also perennial, so it comes back year after year, but it will also be outcompeted when other more long-term species come in. Interesting fact about the fireweed, all parts of it are edible and they've all been used traditionally for various things. And these days it's mostly a jelly species and delicious on some toast or some bannock. This is just a little picture here, and I had a picture at the beginning, the title slide of all that fireweed. Now, one of my favorite things walking through these carpet tundras of fireweed in the summer is the sound of all the bees in the fireweed patches. And this may be surprising to some of you. And it, honestly, when many years ago when I first started going into the Arctic, I was honestly surprised. My assumption would be that there were no native bee species to live in these cold, northerly, harsh environments. But in fact, one of the things that we don't see as a strain or as a problem for these plants is a lack of pollinators. There are lots of pollinators in the Arctic for these species. One of them is the Arctic bumblebee. It is so very cute and so very charming, and they love fireweed and they love all these big purple flowers especially. There are 2 species of bumblebees that live above the Arctic Circle, and they are present in large numbers, so they do pretty well. The one that we have in northern Canada is mostly our, it's called this Bombus polaris, and I guess Canadians, I would certainly include me in this, we all think it's so cute that we even put out stamps of our Arctic bumblebee because they're just that adorable. Imagine the issues facing these bumblebees though, like they have to hibernate about 9 months a year. So just like all the plants that are doing their very best to kick out flowers and make seeds and spread seeds and get everything done in that very short season, these bumblebees have to do the same thing. It's not the only pollinator though, and in fact, it's not even the main pollinator. It's just the cutest one. A lot of these species are pollinated by things like black flies and like mosquitoes. And this is a lovely image. It's not mine. I've never had this many black flies on my shirt. Black flies are actually, despite the fact that they like to bite us, it's only the females that are looking for blood meal, and they only need blood meal to produce young. So when they're laying eggs, they have to take a feed first. But the males and even the females, as they're feeding themselves, will eat pollen and nectar off all of these flowers, and they are the main pollinators of our Arctic areas. So we can't look at them too harshly when we think that they're bringing us all these beautiful flowers. So with that, I'm just going to leave you here with one last beautiful little flower here. That's another late season plant for us. And thank you, and hand it over to Sunny for questions.
Thank you, Eleanor. That was so interesting and so beautiful. All those beautiful little flowers and bees. We do have some questions, so let's go ahead and dive in. About how far north in the Arctic does the snow stay on the ground year round?
How far north in the Arctic does the snow stay on the ground year round? It will depend which part of the world you're in. So areas around Eurasia and so Northern Europe and Siberia, because they are getting different currents that we get in North America, there will be no areas throughout Eurasia that remain ice-free year-round. That remain iced year-round. They may have areas of permafrost, meaning that if you were to take a shovel and dig down, you would come across that permanently frozen ground, but snow will not remain on the ground. And if you think about it, for us to have plants, there has to be at least some time, somewhere along the way, that we're going to have a small growing season, even if it's very, very short. So even in areas of far northern Canada, we would expect, especially these days as we're starting to see more warming of the Arctic, we would expect to see that there will be ice-free zones and ice-free time, really no matter where you are in the Arctic. In areas like Churchill, for example, where I do a lot of summer trips up there, this spring has been a very warm one for them, but often you can still find snow in shaded areas into late June, but that's really about the end of it at that point. You're going to have, in fact, very warm days sometimes through those summer months as we're getting, potentially 18, 20, 24 hours of sunlight. It really does do a good job of warming up the soil, even if it's not for very long.
Okay. Do the insects get to the northern Arctic on the wind?
Do the insects get to the northern Arctic on the wind? Well, there would be
Did you hear that
certainly
question?
some. Yeah, I did. I think so. So I think they're asking here whether those insects are blown in by wind, and that's how they arrive in the springtime. In fact, all of these insect species are able to overwinter in the northern areas that we're talking about. There are a small handful of migratory insects. These are mostly things like dragonflies and damselflies that are able to migrate in some numbers, but the rest of them, they're born there, they live there, they have babies there, and they die there. And we have some species of mosquitoes and black flies that are what we call snowmelt species that really, they lay their larvae in wet patches in the ground or even in early season snow itself. And the moment that snow melts, whoop, it doesn't take long for those guys to come out. And then there's some that will lay their eggs in the later part of the fall into things like water bodies and bogs and marshes. And those ones will usually take some more time to develop in the springtime, and they're often our second batch of insects. So while I talk about black flies kind of as a group, we know that in Churchill, there's at least 23 species of black fly and probably more, and they come in distinct waves because they each have different emergence times. And same things with mosquitoes. Each one may only feed on a number of flowers, and then, for example, an early season black fly will never get the chance to pollinate fireweed because it's already gone off and had its babies and died off for the rest of the year. So there's a lot of seasonality, but they're all local. They're not, with a very, very few exceptions, they're not coming in from more southern areas.
Okay. Do any animals eat the fireweed?
Well, you know, that's a great question. I have never witnessed animals eating the fireweed besides us. Oh, that's not true. Pardon me, let me back up. Humans have eaten fireweed as long as we've known about it. And you can just nibble on it as you like. It's a favorite food of Arctic hares and snowshoe hares as well. So there's usually so much of it that you're not going to see like great big swaths of it getting cut down by a small family of Arctic hares. There's plenty of food to go around. Aside from the hares, I would assume that some of the Arctic rodents eat it, but I don't know that for sure. I just know from experience that other weedy species like this that produce a lot of seeds and a lot of greenery tend to get fed on by things like rodents as well.
Got it. And can you tell us the name of the beautiful little yellow flower on the slide that you're showing right now?
Oh, isn't that a lovely one? So that has a number of potential names. We often just call it like a late season sunflower, or sometimes called an Arctic daisy. It's a beautiful one, and it often comes out kind of late July into August, just like a lot of, if you live in the more southerly latitudes, our asters, like our species in the daisy family, are often late flowering. Same thing happens in the Arctic. Oh, yep, it's a lovely little guy.
Well, that's the last question we have time for today, so I'll hand it back to you for closing comments.
I don't have too many closing comments except to say thank you so much for everybody for coming on by, and hopefully maybe getting a little bit more appreciation, even if you're heading up north to look for whales or birds or something else, and you weren't planning on doing anything besides walking on the flowers. Maybe we'll have some more appreciation for what these little plants have to live with and go through just to be there. So thanks so much for coming by and having a chat, and I hope you get to see some Arctic plants this summer yourself.
Eleanor, thank you again. And I want to thank everybody who tuned in today. Please join us again tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I'll conclude the webinar. Have a wonderful day, everyone.